G'day ladies and gents, and welcome to War Thunder with Mags, and welcome to the last of my subscribers' choice videos, the ME-262 A-1a. Now the 262 was actually the hardest aircraft that I had to get footage, well, good footage for, to do these subscribers' choice videos. This plane has been an absolute pain. It was the first aircraft that I started flying out in order to record, and it's the last one that I'm showing. And in the end, I'm actually going to go back to a video recording from prior to patch 1.7 or patch 1.49 or whatever the hell Gaijin is calling it now, at least for the first battle. Now, why was this plane so hard to get video recordings for? Well, the answer's quite simple. It's not a very good fighter. It's actually a very poorly designed jet aircraft. Now, the first thing I want to say here is I do actually really like the 262, but it's not a very good aircraft. Okay? I can like a thing and still talk negatively about it and not be complaining about the aircraft. In fact, I'm not complaining about it at all. In real life, this aircraft's numbers in-game is actually very comparable to what it was capable of doing in real life. Overall, I think the one in-game is probably slightly slower and has slightly lower acceleration than the real 262 did, but the difference between the real plane and the plane that we see in-game is so small that it wouldn't actually affect combat performance within the game environment. So the fact that the plane is slightly underperforming is entirely irrelevant. This is how the 262 is going to perform, and it was always going to be a problem. Now, the reason why the 262 is not a very good jet is because it was the first jet ever built. Prior to the 262, there were no jet fighters. Germany was writing the first page of the book that would become modern air combat. So let's put away our bias caps for a bit and take a very clinical look at the 262. It's important to do this as her design flaws here are also her weaknesses. So first, let's look at her aerodynamic design. Overall, she's not bad. Smoothly pointed nose, the body is wider than you would generally like, but the flat bottom triangle design of the fuselage actually gives her some body lift, cutting down a cross section, so it's not bad. The tail design is taken directly from the prop fighters of the time and is again fine for her maximum speeds. Her wings being backswept is actually quite a design advancement and works wonders for her speed. Her first true flaw shows itself in the engine nacelles. There's a reason why modern jet fighters don't use this configuration, but modern jet airliners, the buses of the sky, do. When you have an aircraft with a twin jet engine design, you want these engines to be as close together as possible and to the centre of the aircraft, and there's three reasons for this. Firstly is engine performance. When twin jets are placed side by side, the thrust output of the two is combined. Basically, the two engines will push together as one. This is more efficient, allows for better engine performance. When these engines are placed apart, as seen on the 262, the engines each push as their own unit, decreasing their efficiency. The British were also guilty of this fighter design flaw in the Gloucester Meteor series of fighters. It's interesting, however, that Germany actually worked this out before the war ended. The 229 having its spinally mounted engines set very close to the centre axis of the aircraft, and the proposed designs for the HG2 having its engines more centrally mounted, and the HG3 design actually having its engines semi-integrated with the main fuselage. Now the second reason is control. When you have two jet engines close together in the central body of an aircraft, their centre of thrust lines up with the rudder axis of the aircraft, making your control very accurate. However, wing-mounted engines result in the rudder of an aircraft having to fight the thrust of one of the wing-mounted engines during a yaw manoeuvre. This makes rudder movement less precise, and since precision is one of the most important things in a jet aircraft, this is a very bad design decision. Now the final reason is of course drag. With the engines tucked into the fuselage of the aircraft, the overall forward cross-section of the plane is reduced, lowering the overall drag of the aircraft. Wing-mounted pylons on the 262 have almost the same forward cross-section as the wings they are mounted to. They alone represent 1/4 of the drag coefficient of the 262 and cost her around about 80 to 100 km an hour of her potential top speed. Now of course, when Germany designed the 262 originally, there was no information on any of this. There was no book that you could pick up that explained all of this. This is what Germany had to discover for itself during the design process of the 262. You have to remember, when the 262 was originally designed, the idea of transonic aviation, aircraft that could move faster than the speed of sound, was considered to be an impossibility. Hell, at the time the 262 was being designed, all the nations excluding Britain considered jet aviation to be an impossibility. The US in particular actually considered jet aviation to be nothing more than a pipe dream, until one of the members of the Department of Defense actually got to view the prototype for the Gloucester Meteor and realised exactly how far the US was behind the rest of the world in aviation technology. So, we've covered the 262's aerodynamics, so let's move on to its next weakness, speed control. During the design development of the 262, Germany was obsessed with building the fastest aircraft they could, an aircraft so fast that it was uncatchable by her enemies. This is exactly what they achieved. However, the lack of understanding of jet combat at the time meant they completely overlooked one simple truth. Sometimes you need to slow down. The lack of speed control caused the 262 many problems in real life. The high speed of her approaches on both fighters and slow-moving bomber formations made accurate shooting difficult on the pilots, forcing many 262 pilots to have to back off on the throttles in order to score kills. With the slow spool time of early jet engines, this left pilots vulnerable to attack from their slower-moving propeller-driven opponents. It also made 262s extremely vulnerable when landing. With no air brakes, the 262s needed several kilometres of approach space on runways to be able to land, the time they needed to slow down. During this time, they were easy prey for lurking Allied aircraft, most notably the Typhoons and the Tempests, that destroyed many 262s on final approach. In War Thunder, the 262 is quite a fast aircraft, capable of easily maintaining between 600 to 700 km an hour in level flight when fully upgraded, and is able to hit at well over 900 km an hour in a dive. She's also very manoeuvrable in elevation turns. However, just like her real-world counterpart, she has almost no speed control, and she has almost exactly the same weaknesses as the real 262. The lack of air brakes means that almost any competent propeller-driven pilot in War Thunder will be able to cause the 262 to overshoot. All jet pilots, excluding those who fly the MiG-9, have it even easier, as they can force a 262 to overshoot simply by deploying air brakes and putting their aircraft into a hard bank. Media pilots will find that with correct usage of their air brakes, they'll actually be able to turn inside of 262s. This ability makes the Meteor simply the most dangerous opponent a 262 pilot can face in battle. When landing the 262 in War Thunder, you'll find it suffers exactly the same issues as a real-world counterpart. The 262 will not want to bleed speed below 400 km an hour and will require some manoeuvring on behalf of the pilot in order to do so. This need to manoeuvre prevents the aircraft from performing the kind of high-speed landings that can be performed in, for example, the Meteor or the Shooting Star, as it simply takes longer for the 262 to get its speed down to safe landing levels. Again, this is an issue that was solved by Germany before the end of the war, with the 229 having air brakes and both the HG2 and HG3 intended to receive them. The sole exclusion was the 162, but that was a cheaply built aircraft, and it's safe to assume that air brakes were not fitted as a cost-cutting measure and to simplify the design for rapid production. So, the third and final weakness of the 262, and this is a surprising one because it's actually her own guns. The 262's 4 machine cannon 108s give the aircraft simply the highest burst mass rating of any aircraft in the game at 14.5 kilograms per second of high explosive depth. She's not a plane that you want to get in front of, well, at least not at close range. And this leads to the main problem with these guns, their velocity. The muzzle velocity of the 108 is only 540 meters per second, or 1,944 kilometers an hour. This sounds like a lot until you realise that the MG151 20mm cannon can put a shell down range at 2,520 km an hour, and the American Brownings can do the same at over 3,200 km an hour. The large size and heavy weight of the projectile also lead to 108 rounds having an immense deceleration and drop rate, losing around half their speed for every 500 meters they travel. A 30mm round from a 108 fired while flying level leaves at a muzzle velocity of around 1,944 km an hour, but by the time it's travelled 500 meters, its speed has dropped to just under 1,000 km an hour. Ever wonder why you just couldn't seem to hit that saber back when the 262 had its old battle rating? Despite your perfect aim, it was because the saber was moving faster than your shell was. At 1,000 meters, the shell velocity is down to little more than 250 kilometers an hour and is travelling rapidly towards the ground at a 45-degree angle. It's worth keeping this in mind, as anyone who flies a 262 with a gun convergence of 800 meters will need to remember that as the 108 round reaches that convergence point, it will be doing a little more than 350 kilometers an hour. If you're trying to hit an opponent from behind that is doing better than 350, you need to fire to counter their speed or you'll miss. Now, you'll often hear pilots suggest you go nose to nose in 262s. This is actually a bad idea. It will work really well if you're facing an incompetent pilot or one that doesn't shoot well, but if you're facing somebody who knows what they're doing, it's almost a guaranteed way of getting yourself shot down. You'll actually see a perfect example of this in a second. The fighter I'm about to go nose to nose against is the MiG-9. Now, the 37mm on it is devastating, but the gun we're really interested in is the 23mm cannons that it's armed with. Now, these 23mm cannons have a velocity of 690 meters per second, or 2,484 kilometers per hour. This is around 500 kilometers an hour faster than the shells from the 108. Now, what this means is in a head-on situation, you can actually fire before the MiG-9 will. As you'll see here, I fire first. But the MiG-9 actually kills me before I kill him. His shells land home before mine do. Now, the 23mm on the MiG-9 are actually not known for their velocity either. They are not much better than the 108s, so this was actually a fairly close fight, and which is why we ended up mutually killing one another in this head-on pass, as neither one of us really had the time to avoid the other one's shots. However, if this had been a Gloster Meteor with Hispano Mark Vs, the 20mm Hispano Mark Vs on a Meteor have a velocity of 840 meters per second. They're actually very, very good aircraft guns. That's 3,024 kilometers an hour. That's 1,000 kilometers an hour higher velocity than the guns on the 262. What this means is the Meteor can actually fire after a 262 does and still have time to be able to avoid the 262 shots, while the 262 will not have time to avoid the Gloster Meteors. So, why that head-on did cost me my plane, it did also secure the match with 3 kills for my team, 62,820 research points, a couple awards. It wasn't a bad match overall. 2 props and a MiG-9 is not a bad way to go, and making sure that the team won, it was worth the cost of the aircraft. I'll also claim a bit of a moral victory on it, because my 262 still had one wing intact, where I blew both the wings off the MiG-9, so 4,146 research points, and this was the match right before I actually spaded the aircraft. This is the R1 rocket modification. It's the last modification that I have to unlock on the 262. So, yeah, it was the very next match that I actually spaded the aircraft. Now, as I said at the beginning, it might seem like I'm being very negative about the 262. The reality is I'm actually not. A lot of these problems are problems that the 262 either did or would have experienced in real life were it to fight the opponents that it fights in War Thunder. The actual accuracy of the flight model is remarkable. As a primary example here, the 262's guns. I've just finished talking about them. They are very, very, very poor guns for jet combat. Why? Well, the 262 was the first jet ever built. It was never designed to fight other jets because nobody else was supposed to have them. This was a German superweapon, not an Allied one. Germany was not expecting to encounter jet aircraft in the sky, so the aircraft was not armed to deal with extremely high-speed jet fighters. It was armed to deal with slow-moving props. Specifically, it was armed to deal with slow-moving formations of B-17s. The aerodynamic weaknesses of the 262 were because nobody had ever built a jet fighter before. Germany was working with what they had managed to work out up until that point, and it's interesting that the British made exactly the same mistakes, putting the engines in the wings as they did. They went about trying to fix it in different ways. The Gloster Meteor they tried to put more powerful engines in and sleek the nacelles within the wings, where if you look at the German designs, their intention was to pull them into the fuselage, which is really what everybody else in the world did, not 10 years later. Another interesting one, and going back to the Meteor again, the Meteor is equipped with air brakes. Why is the Meteor equipped with air brakes for? How did the British see that they were going to need air brakes? Why Germany didn't? Well, because Germany already had 262s in the sky, and Allied fighters that engaged the 262s reported that the 262s were having trouble slowing down, that they were always incredibly fast. By putting the first operational jet fighters in the sky, Germany effectively beta tested the jet fighter concept for the rest of the world. When the Meteor F3 went into production by the Gloster Company, they had seen and read the reports on the issues that the 262s were having in combat, and so they made sure that air brakes were fitted in order to counter the problem before they ever got into combat. Overall, the 262's performance in War Thunder is average. It's extremely good when it encounters an inexperienced enemy. However, experienced pilots will easily be able to exploit the flaws in the 262's design. And the flaws that the 262 carries are not flaws that have been implemented by Gaijin in any way. These are flaws that were actually inherent in the 262, and flaws that Germany was trying to work out of their design at the point that they were defeated in World War II. Design flaws, honestly, are the cost of coming first in any technology race. You put something out there first, It's first, but it'll always be less refined than everything that comes after. Anyways, ladies and gents, I hope you enjoyed this video. Click like if you do, subscribe if you want to see more. Fly smart, fly safe, and I'll catch you in the skies.